studying Isaiah chapter 15 this week. We'll be going over and starting the burden of Moab. Before we get into that, we're going to go through and do a little bit of studying to understand who Moab is, who that nation is, what their relationship is with Israel. Babylon, which we did first, was kind of an oddity. They up to that point when Isaiah was doing his prophesying, there wasn't really much of a relationship at that time between Babylon and Judah, or Babylon and Israel. However, Moab has a very long relationship at this time with those nations. So we're going to go back and we'll start in Genesis chapter 19. We'll read here in verse 29 down to verse 38 to get, and we'll start and we'll just go through the Old Testament and get some basic history about Moab. So starting in Genesis chapter 19, verse 29, it says, "And it came to pass, when God destroyed the cities of the plain, that God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow, when he overthrew the cities in which Lot dwelt. And Lot went up out of Zoar, and dwelt in the mountain, and his 2 daughters with him, for he feared to dwell in Zoar. And he dwelt in a cave, he and his 2 daughters." So again, this is at the time when God has destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, and Lot has went to this other city in this plain country, which is south of the Dead Sea, and he's decided that it's too scary to be in Zoar, most likely because the same types of sins were being committed in Zoar that were committed in Sodom and Gomorrah, and so he feared that the same judgment would come on them as well. So in verse 31, it says, "And the firstborn," one of his daughters, "and the firstborn said unto the younger, Our father is old, and there is not a man in the earth to come in unto us after the manner of all the earth." And so here, they think the world is ending. Not only that, but they probably had difficulty finding men where they came from to begin with. So most likely that was the case in Zoar. They thought that everything was coming to an end. They thought that there would be no men, if there were men alive, that none of them around were going to have any interest in them. So for some reason they decided to come up with this sinful idea. In verse 32 it says, "Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, that we may preserve the seed of our father. And they made their father drink wine that night. And the firstborn went in and lay with her father, and he perceived not when she lay down, nor when she arose. And it came to pass on the morrow that the firstborn said unto the younger, Behold, I lay yesternight with my father. Let us make him drink wine this night also, and go thou in, and lie with him, that we may preserve seed of our father. And they made their father drink wine that night also, and the younger arose and lay with him, and he perceived not when she lay down, nor when she arose. Thus were both the daughters of Lot with child by their father. And the firstborn bare a son, and called his name Moab, the same as the father of the Moabites unto this day. And the younger, she also bare a son, and called his name Ben-Ammi, the same as the father of the children of Ammon unto this day. So this is the origin, the starting point of the nation of Moab. We get the starting point of the nation of Israel with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We get the starting point of the nation of Ishmael, the Arab peoples, with Ishmael, Abraham's first son. Here we get the starting point of Moab and of Ammon. And all of those people, whether for good or bad, Abraham and his family, they did a lot in that part of the world. You see God blessed Abraham so that his seed went on to do many things, and God allowed the same kind of things to happen with Abraham's relatives. You see here, Moab and Ammon were great kingdoms in that part of the world for a long time. Great as in they covered large lands. They weren't necessarily the wealthiest kingdoms. They were not at all spiritually correct. But as far as worldly standards go, they would have been pretty mighty kingdoms for their time. So we'll now skip ahead a few books to Numbers chapter 22. Numbers chapter 22. Next time that the people of Israel have a lot of dealings with Moab, Remember, they were in Egypt for 400 years, so they weren't even in that part of the land. And so they didn't deal with Moab for quite a while. This is when they first start dealing with Moab here in the book of Numbers. If you remember when we did our study on Edom, when they came out of Egypt, they crossed the Red Sea. They went through the wilderness. They wanted to go up and get a look at the promised land. They wanted to go through Edom. They wanted to go through those lands. Edom wouldn't let them. They told them go around. So they had to go up through Moab and Ammon. And they ended up in the land of Moab on the east side of the Jordan River. So it says in chapter 22 of Numbers, verse 1, "And the children of Israel set forward and pitched in the plains of Moab on this side Jordan by Jericho. And Balak the son of Zippor saw all that Israel had done to the Amorites. And Moab was sore afraid of the people because they were many, and Moab was distressed because of the children of Israel. And Moab said unto the elders of Midian, Now shall this company lick up all that are round about us, as the ox licketh up the grass of the field. And Balak the son of Zippor was king of the Moabites at that time." Now we won't go through and read that whole story of Balak and Balaam this morning. Most everybody in here is fairly familiar with that story. But the basic idea is that the Moabites were scared because Israel's numbers were very large. And Balak wanted to curse the people of Israel so he could win. He sends for this false prophet Balaam. And we'll look here in Numbers chapter 24, verses 10 to 19, because Balaam was unable to curse the people of Israel. God would not allow him to do it. So it says in verse 10 here in Numbers chapter 24, "And Balak's anger was kindled against Balaam, and he smote his hands together. And Balak said unto Balaam, I called thee to curse mine enemies, and behold, thou hast altogether blessed them these 3 times. So if you remember, Balaam, unable to curse them, instead the words that came out of his mouth were blessings toward the people of Israel. It says in verse 11, "Therefore now flee thou to thy place. I thought to promote thee unto great honor, but lo, the Lord hath kept thee back from honor. And Balaam said unto Balak, Spake I not also to thy messengers, which thou sentest unto me, saying, If Balak would give me his house full of silver and gold, I cannot go beyond the commandment of the Lord to do either good or bad of mine own mind, but what the Lord saith, that will I speak. And now, behold, I go unto my people, and come therefore, and I will advertise thee what this people shall do to thy people in the latter days." We'll read a few more verses now. "And he took up his parable, and said, Balaam the son of Beor hath said, and the man whose eyes are open hath said, he hath said, which heard the words of God, and knew the knowledge of the Most High, which saw the vision of the Almighty, falling into a trance, but having his eyes open, I shall see him, but not now. I shall behold him, but not nigh. There shall come a star out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel, and shall smite the corners of Moab, and destroy all the children of Sheth. And Edom shall be a possession, Seir also shall be possession for his enemies, and Israel shall do valiantly. Out of Jacob shall come he that shall have dominion, and shall destroy him that remaineth out of the city." So, in relation to Moab, and also Edom is mentioned here, it says there will be a star out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. Does anybody, just by chance, remember whose tribe the scepter was with? There wasn't a physical scepter, by the way. But one tribe did have the scepter, metaphorically. Does anybody remember which tribe that was of Israel that had the scepter? It was the tribe of Judah. Judah had the scepter, and the scepter shall not depart from Judah. Jesus is that scepter. Jesus is that star. Jesus is the one that shall have dominion. Jesus is the one that will rule. Whether or not you want to take it as Jesus in his pre-incarnate form was involved in leading the armies and was involved in leading the, whether you want to say in like he did in Jericho where he advised Joshua to march around the city, or if you want to think about it as what we see in the book of Daniel where there's wars against these demonic powers and these demonic principalities on the earth. Whether you want to think that he was assisting in that way, or if you want to think that this is judgment that's yet to come. You're probably right either way, if I just had to guess, that this is reference to something that has already happened and something that is yet to happen. But we know this story about Balak and Balaam. Balak, he continues to try to seek out to get one over on the people of Israel. Balaam comes up with this idea. He's unable to curse them, but he has this idea. And so here is the fruition of his idea in Numbers chapter 25, verse 1. It says, "And Israel abode in Shittim, and the people began to commit whoredom with the daughters of Moab." And then in verse 2 it says, "And they called the people unto the sacrifices of their gods, and the people did eat and bowed down to their gods. And Israel joined himself unto Baal Peor, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel." Balaam had a pretty devious idea there, which was to, rather than make war against the people, invite them in, let them marry the daughters, let them come in and intermix and start worshiping the same gods rather than the Lord. And so in verse 4 it says here, "And the Lord said unto Moses, Take all the heads of the people, and hang them up before the Lord against the sun, that the fierce anger of the Lord may be turned away from Israel. And Moses said unto the judges of Israel, Slay ye every one his men that were joined unto Baal Peor." And so there's a great slaughter there in the tribes of Israel because of that great sin that was committed. In order to rid the camp of sin, just like they did with Achan, which had not even happened yet at this time. This was a model for what was to happen with Achan. They had to get rid of the sin that was in the camp. So, moving on here, the next we'll see here in Deuteronomy chapter 34. The children of Israel were forced to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. They come back to the land of Moab. They're going to cross the Jordan River. They're going to go into Jericho. That's the Lord's plan for them to start retaking what he had promised them. Deuteronomy chapter 34, verses 1 to 5 says, "And Moses went up from the plains of Moab unto the mountain of Nebo, to the top of Pisgah that is over against Jericho, and the Lord showed him all the land of Gilead unto Dan, and all Naphtali, and the land of Ephraim, and Manasseh, and all the land of Judah unto the utmost sea, and the south and the plain of the valley of Jericho, and the city of palm trees unto Zoar. And the Lord said unto him, This is the land which I swear unto Abraham and Isaac, unto Isaac and unto Jacob, saying, I will give it unto thy seed. I have caused thee to see it with thine eyes, but thou shalt not go over thither. So Moses the servant of the Lord died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord." And that's where Moses met his end. There, God did not allow him to cross over into the promised land at that time. Did Moses ever make it to the promised land? Yeah, he did. Who spoke with Moses? Who spoke with Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration?
Boy, I'm talking about the land itself.
Well, he was there. He made it, and he'll be back again. At this time he wasn't there, but he did end up making it. He got to see it for a brief moment when he was speaking to Jesus. Wouldn't that be something? Your first visit to the promised land, you're speaking with the Son of God. And you've already been glorified. You've already been to heaven. You've seen heaven. You get to come down and see this promised land, which Jesus is going to rule one day. Jesus, I like to think sometimes about what Moses was talking to Jesus about with Elijah. Personally, my belief is it was something to do with their duties that they would have as the two witnesses in the future. I can't say for sure. They may have been talking about something that was, just maybe an inside joke that they'd had between themselves in heaven. I don't know. But I have a feeling that it was probably something that was to happen when they were the witnesses. Jesus was giving them some kind of encouragement, maybe. I really have no idea. They were talking about something. That's what we do know. So Moses died there in the land of Moab, and that was on Mount Nebo. We're not going to read it, but in Joshua chapter 13, you see that the distribution of the inheritance to a few of the tribes. Manasseh, the half-tribe of Manasseh, the tribe of Gad, and the tribe of Reuben all received land that actually originally, don't want to say originally, but their inheritance was in the land of Moab, on the east side of the Jordan River. Today, that is the modern-day nation of Jordan. If you look at a map and you see it, on the east side of the Jordan River, the northernmost inheritance was Manasseh. underneath him was Gad, and then underneath him was Reuben. Reuben was kind of along the Dead Sea and the first part of the Jordan River, which is north of the Dead Sea. Well, next, we won't read it, but we'll touch on Judges chapter 3. In Judges chapter 3, Israel was actually now underneath Moab. They had gone into the land of Canaan. They'd conquered all these peoples. After the deaths of Moses and Joshua was the period of the judges. At that time, Ehud was going to be a judge. They were under the king of Eglon. Ehud became a judge. He went and he killed Eglon, the king of Moab. He pretended to have a present for him. He got in the room alone with him, pulled out a dagger, and stabbed him. And the Bible describes it that Eglon was a fat man. And so he had to do some work to get that dagger deep enough to kill him. But he ended up doing the job. We'll look here and we'll read in 1 Samuel. There's something I do want to touch on that's between Judges and 1 Samuel, but we'll talk about that in a minute. 1 Samuel chapter, it'll make more sense if I do it now. Who's the most famous Moabite in the Bible? Does anybody have any idea? They might not be famous for being a Moabite, but they're probably the most famous Moabite in the Bible. Ruth. She's a Moabitess. Ended up becoming the grandmother of David, and was also part of the line of Christ. As the grandmother of David, she also, Jesus was descended from her, as he was descended from David when he was born on this earth. So she had a part in that, and she was, probably the only, one of the only godly Moabite people you'll ever see in the Bible. I don't know that you'll ever get a good example like her anywhere else. But she believed in following the Lord. She put off those false gods, and she went with her mother-in-law back to the nations of Israel and into the land of Judah. And she met Boaz, and she married Boaz. They gave birth to Obed. She was the great-grandmother of David. Obed gave birth to Jesse, and Jesse eventually ended up giving birth to David. So now we'll go into 1 Samuel chapter 22. 1 Samuel chapter 22. 1 Samuel 22, we'll start reading here in verse 1. It says, David therefore departed thence and escaped to the cave Adullam, and when his brethren and all his father's house heard it, they went down thither to him. And everyone that was in distress, and everyone that was in debt, and everyone that was discontented, gathered themselves unto him, and he became a captain over them, and there were with him about 400 men. I like that. David gathered to himself the distressed, the indebted, and the discontented. He didn't have a happy person in his bunch. But they were there. It says in verse 3, And David went thence to Mizpah of Moab, and he said unto the king of Moab, Let my father and my mother, I pray thee, come forth and be with you, till I know what God will do for me. And he brought them before the king of Moab, and they dwelt with him all the while that David was in the hold. And so you see there, he put his parents, he put his family in safekeeping because Saul was out to get him. And he was afraid Saul was going to come after his family, so he put them in Moab. Well, why would he think to take them there? Well, they're related. Remember, Ruth is his great-grandmother. She's the grandmother of David's father. So he believed it would probably be a fairly safe place to keep them. Going into 2 Samuel chapter 8. 2 Samuel chapter 8, verses 1 to 2. This is something that happened much later. It says, And after this it came to pass that David smote the Philistines and subdued them, and David took Metheg-ammah out of the hand of the Philistines. And he smote Moab, and measured them with a line, casting them down to the ground, even with 2 lines measured he, to put to death, and with 1 full line to keep alive. And so the Moabites became David's servants, and brought gifts. And so there you see the conquest of the Moabites. 1 Kings chapter 11. This is a very unfortunate turn of events here. 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 7. Then did Solomon build an high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, in the hill that is before Jerusalem, and for Molech, the abomination of the children of Ammon. A very, very, very unfortunate turn of events that Solomon built these places for these false gods. I don't know much about Chemosh. I know more about Molech. But the Moabites they had a temple to Chemosh at one point in time. And the Ammonites had a temple to Molech. We know about Molech. Molech was the one who they would sacrifice their firstborn children to. And the Jewish people ended up getting into that eventually. But you see here, there's some mixing between the religious beliefs of the Jewish people and the Moabite people and the Ammonite people, unfortunately. So we'll move forward and look at 2 Kings chapter 3. They get away from what the Lord wants them to do, and this is what the end result here is. 2 Kings chapter 3, verse 5. It says, But it came to pass when Ahab was dead that the king of Moab rebelled against the king of Israel. And so they did have them under conquest. They had them controlled. Solomon ended up, trying to converge their religions in an unfortunate, act, in a sinful act. He did these things, and if I had to guess, it was probably because he was married to a bunch of Moabite women that served these false gods. He was married to a bunch of Ammonite women who served false gods. He was married to a bunch of Zidonian women. He was married to a bunch of Egyptian women, at least one Egyptian woman he was married to. He went the wrong way very fast. So they ended up rebelling in 2 Kings chapter 3. Next we see in the book of Nehemiah, this is something that has yet to even happen where we're at in Isaiah, but I do want to touch on it. Well, before Nehemiah, we might as well look at Psalms chapter 60, since that comes actually in more along the chronological line of events. Psalm chapter 60, and this verse is repeated elsewhere, and we've read this verse before when we did our study of Edom. It says in Psalm 60, verse 8, Moab is my washpot, over Edom will I cast out my shoe. Philistia, triumph thou because of me. And that verse is repeated again in the Psalms elsewhere. The basic idea is that Israel would eventually have total control over Moab. That there would not be an issue, there would not be any issues of rebellion, there would not be any issues of even sin. Moab is my washpot. Would you wash in a place that's dirty? Would you wash in a place that's pagan and, spiritually or physically? Would you want to go to a pagan, horrible place and have that be your washing place? I wouldn't want to. Then in the book of Nehemiah, and we'll after Nehemiah, we'll go back to the book of Isaiah. But in Nehemiah chapter 13, remember, this is something that's yet to happen even where we're at in the book of Isaiah. But since we're doing this little historical run through the Old Testament, I figured we might as well hit this one too. Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 23. Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 23. In those days also saw I Jews that had married wives of Ashdod, of Ammon, and of Moab, and their children spake half in the speech of Ashdod, and could not speak in the Jews' language, but according to the language of each people. And I contended with them, and cursed them, and smote certain of them, and plucked off their hair, and made them swear by God, saying, Ye shall not give your daughters unto their sons, nor take their daughters unto your sons, or for yourselves. Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin by these things? Yet among many nations was there no king like him, who was beloved of his God, and God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, even him did outlandish women cause to sin. So, part of this group of people that they were marrying were Moabite women. And it says Nehemiah contended with them, cursed them, and smote certain of them, and plucked off their hair. He didn't waste time. He got physical with them over this. If I had to guess, when he was helping overseeing the building of the wall, he might have had some kind of the same attitude. That might be part of the reason why they got to doing it so quick, was because he wouldn't put up with slacking off. I don't know. I do know that he didn't have any qualms about getting physical with them here on this issue. So, you see, even after the judgments that we're going to read about in Isaiah, the children of Israel still come to sin through the people of Moab. They still come to sin through these surrounding nations. That's why judgment is necessary on all of these nations and on Israel and on Judah. We've read about plenty of judgments in other books of the Bible on Israel and Judah. But again, in Isaiah chapters 13 through 23, these are focusing on the surrounding nations, neighboring nations, nations that either have or will have a relationship with Israel or Judah. So, 9 verses in chapter 15. We'll read these 9 and we'll go through them pretty quick. Isaiah chapter 15, starting in verse 1. It says, "The burden of Moab, because in the night Ar of Moab is laid waste and brought to silence, because in the night Kir of Moab is laid waste and brought to silence. He has gone up to Bajith and to Dibon, the high places, to weep. Moab shall howl over Nebo and over Medeba. On all their heads shall be baldness, and every beard cut off. In their streets they shall gird themselves with sackcloth on the tops of their houses, and in the streets every one shall howl, weeping abundantly. And Heshbon shall cry, and Elealeh. Their voices shall be heard, even unto Jahaz. Therefore the armed soldiers of Moab shall cry out. His life shall be grievous unto him. My heart shall cry out for Moab, his fugitives shall flee unto Zoar, and heifer of 3 years old, for by the mounting up of Luhith with weeping shall they go it up, for in the way of Horonaim they shall raise up a cry of destruction. For the waters of Nimrim shall be desolate, for the hay is withered away, the grass faileth, where there is no green thing. Therefore the abundance they have gotten, and that which they have laid up, shall they carry away to the brook of the willows. For the cry has gone round about the borders of Moab, the howling thereof unto Eglaim, and the howling thereof unto Beer Elim. And for the waters of Dimon shall be full of blood, for I will bring more upon Dimon, lions upon him that escapeth of Moab, and upon the remnant of the land." And so that's pretty straightforward there. You see all of these words that are that you may be unfamiliar with and difficult to pronounce. These are places in Moab. These are cities. You should be familiar where it says in verse 2, Moab shall howl over Nebo. That's the area of Mount Nebo. We just read about that earlier. That's where Moses died. That's where his life ended on this earth. But it says in verse 3, "In their streets they shall gird themselves with sackcloth on the tops of their houses, and in their streets everyone shall howl, weeping abundantly." Says at the end of verse 4, "Therefore the armed soldiers of Moab shall cry out, his life shall be grievous unto him." They're going to get to a point where their life just is just punishment. Life itself is just suffering. No redeeming qualities, nothing to break up the suffering, nothing to break up the hardship and the difficulty. It says in verse 5, "My heart shall cry out for Moab. His fugitives shall flee unto Zoar, and heifer of 3 years old, for by the mounting up of Luhith with weeping shall they go it up." And so I believe Isaiah interjects that here, "My heart shall cry out for Moab." That is how bad it's going to be. Isaiah here is sympathizing with these people. He understands it's going to be very, very difficult for those that undergo this destruction and this judgment, this burden. It says in verse 6, "For the waters of Nimrim shall be desolate, for the hay is withered away, the grass faileth, there is no green thing." They're going to lose water, they're going to lose Crops, they're going to lose the ability to feed their animals. When you lose the ability to feed your animals die. When your animals die, you lose the ability to feed yourself. Makes it much more difficult. It says in verse 7, "Therefore the abundance they have gotten, and that which they have laid up, shall they carry away to the brook of the willows. For the cry has gone round about the borders of Moab, the howling thereof unto Eglaim, and the howling thereof unto Beer-elim." And so it's going to be around the whole country. It's not going to be one central specific location. The whole country will be dealing with this. It says, "For the waters of Dimon shall be full of blood, for I will bring more upon Dimon, lions upon him that escapeth of Moab, and upon the remnant of the land." For those that try to get out of the country and escape the famine, escape the death, escape whatever judgment is to fall upon them, if they try to escape, lions upon him that escapeth of Moab, and upon the remnant of the land. God will send lions once they escape their borders to hunt them and chase them down. They will not have an easy time of it. This is judgment. This is death. This is destruction. Looking ahead, we've got another chapter to deal with, so there's going to be more judgment on Moab. It's not over yet. Now, that being said, I do believe that these specific judgments that we're seeing here, the judgments of the water being dried up, the judgments of the crops dying, if you look at that country of Jordan today, you ever see it on the map? You ever just look at a satellite image on Google Maps or something of, just when you're, I do, when sometimes I'll scroll over and I'll look at Israel, and you see there's a lot of green there in certain parts of Israel. And then you look right on the east side of the Jordan River. It's all tan, gray, light brown, it's desert. I don't know why they live there. I don't know why they stay. There's nothing there. The capital city of Amman is, it's a poor, I'll use the word, I guess, unprepossessing place. It is not a place that is to be looked upon. It is a place that is downright ugly. And so, that I think that, that's the lasting effects of the judgment that God placed on those people, that land is still cursed. And again, that goes back to something that we as the church, the church, we don't have that connection to the land. But these people, in this time in the Old Testament, the Jewish people, the people of Israel had a very strong connection to the land that was promised to them. What they did, the way they acted, affected how their land, how God blessed and cursed their land. You may see that a little bit throughout the church age, but it's not as consistent. God has sent famines, I believe. God has sent great cataclysms and storms as judgment. But I think that the basic ability to perform agriculture, that's something that it's just, that they had a very strong connection to that, and the people of Moab had a very strong connection to that. And God cursed their land for it. And I think it's still under that curse. All you got to do is look at a satellite image of the country of Jordan, and it is a desolate place. So you look at the same thing, Saudi Arabia, you look at the same thing for most of Egypt, other than what's directly along the Nile River. You look at the same thing for countries like Libya. There's great places that people used to go. They were once represented great kingdoms, and now they're just deserts with nothing going for them. So, we don't want to experience that kind of judgment. It's not something you want to go through. It's not something you think, well, these people, they could have got through it. That's, if you think that, you're missing the point. Because no, you don't get through that. You don't get through starvation. Starvation gets you. Any comments or questions this morning?